Ringo Starr spent a lifetime smiling for cameras, interviews, and audiences who saw him as the easygoing heart of the Beatles. His humor felt effortless, his presence calming, his role uncomplicated. But behind that familiar expression lived a man shaped by quiet wounds he rarely spoke about. Fame did not erase insecurity, it amplified it. For decades, he carried private bitterness toward people who had once stood close enough to feel like family. These were not shallow disagreements or fleeting arguments, but deeper emotional fractures that never fully healed. What makes Ringo's story compelling is not loud conflict, but quiet endurance. He wasn't the one breaking up sessions or dominating headlines. Instead, he absorbed tension, internalized doubt, and tried to hold things together. Over time, that restraint became its own burden. While the world celebrated the Beatles as an unbreakable unit, Ringo experienced something very different behind the scenes. Relationships shifted, trust eroded, and subtle moments left lasting scars. Eventually, he admitted that one name haunted him more than any critic or rival ever could, and understanding why requires looking beyond the public image into the quieter, more complicated reality of his life. A childhood marked by illness and isolation. Before music gave him purpose, Ringo Starr's early life was defined by fragility and absence. Born Richard Starkey in Liverpool during wartime, he spent much of his childhood in hospitals rather than classrooms. At 6 years old, peritonitis nearly took his life, forcing him into recovery for over a year. Just as he began to regain some normalcy, tuberculosis struck at 13, confining him to a sanatorium for 2 more years. These weren't just medical setbacks, they shaped his identity. While other children developed confidence through education and social interaction, Ringo fell behind academically and emotionally. He grew up feeling disconnected, unsure of himself, and quietly inferior to those around him. The world seemed to move forward without him, leaving him to catch up in ways he never quite felt he managed. What changed everything was a simple drum given to him during recovery. It wasn't meant to start a career, it was just something to pass the time. But in those quiet hospital moments, rhythm became a language he could understand. Drumming didn't demand academic excellence or social dominance. It gave him control, consistency, and eventually, confidence. That fragile beginning would later collide with global fame in ways few could have predicted, becoming the beat that held the Beatles together. By the early 1960s, the Beatles were building momentum, but lacked a steady rhythmic core. Ringo, already performing with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, had earned a reputation for reliability and feel rather than flash. When he joined the Beatles in August 1962, it seemed like a natural fit. He wasn't the loudest personality or the most technically celebrated musician, but he brought something essential: stability. Fans quickly embraced him. His charm felt genuine, his humor approachable, and his drumming grounded the band's evolving sound. But while audiences welcomed him, the industry remained skeptical. Critics labeled him lucky rather than skilled. Some dismissed him outright, reducing his role to simply keeping time. This perception didn't just exist externally, it seeped into Ringo's own thinking. Inside the band, he saw a hierarchy forming. John Lennon and Paul McCartney dominated songwriting. George Harrison fought for recognition as a guitarist and composer. Ringo, meanwhile, often felt like an accessory rather than a contributor. Even moments that should have validated him came with doubt attached. When producer George Martin brought in a session drummer during early recordings, it reinforced a painful message: he was replaceable. That idea would stay with him, quietly shaping how he interpreted every conflict that followed. Living in the shadow of his bandmates, Ringo's role within the Beatles was both essential and limiting. He was the drummer, the steady presence, the one who rarely disrupted the group dynamic, but that position came with an unspoken expectation to support rather than lead. Over time, this created a sense of invisibility that became harder to ignore. John and Paul were celebrated as musical geniuses, their partnership driving the band's creative direction. George, though often overshadowed, still carved out a space as a serious songwriter. Ringo, however, struggled to define his identity within that structure. His contributions were subtle, and subtlety is often overlooked in an environment driven by bold ideas and strong personalities. This imbalance didn't always manifest as conflict. More often, it appeared as quiet doubt. Ringo questioned whether he truly belonged at the same level as the others. He wondered if his role was valued or merely tolerated. These thoughts weren't fueled by dramatic confrontations, but by small, repeated signals that accumulated over time. The result was a deep-rooted insecurity that influenced how he experienced every disagreement. What might have been minor tensions for others felt like confirmation of his fears, and that emotional lens made later betrayals cut far deeper than they otherwise might have. The quiet distance that hurt more than conflict. Among all the relationships within the Beatles, Ringo's connection with George Harrison was once the most comfortable. They shared a similar position, both living in the shadow of Lennon and McCartney, both striving for recognition in different ways. Mutual understanding created a bond that felt genuine and supportive, but as the years passed, that connection began to fade. George grew increasingly interested in collaborating outside the band, working with other musicians, and exploring new creative directions. For Ringo, this shift wasn't just professional, it felt personal. The person he related to most was slowly drifting away, and there was no clear explanation why. What made it especially painful was the lack of confrontation. There were no dramatic arguments or explicit rejections. Instead, there was silence. Invitations that never came, projects that didn't include him, moments where he realized he was no longer part of George's inner circle. This kind of distance can be more damaging than open conflict. Without words, there's no closure, no understanding, no resolution. Ringo was left to interpret the silence on his own, and given his insecurities, he interpreted it as rejection. Over time, that quiet separation became one of the most emotionally confusing aspects of his experience in the band, a studio moment that changed everything. One particular moment during the late 1960s captured the shifting dynamics within the Beatles. While working on a song that would become iconic, George Harrison chose to bring in an outside guitarist rather than rely solely on his bandmates. From a creative standpoint, it made sense, but emotionally, it carried a different weight for Ringo. To him, it wasn't just about music, it was about trust. The Beatles had built their identity on being a unit, a self-contained force. Bringing in an outsider suggested that the unit was no longer enough. It reinforced the idea that anyone could be replaced if necessary. For Ringo, who had already experienced doubts about his place in the band, this moment felt like confirmation of his worst fears. If George could look outside the group for something essential, what did that say about the value of those inside it? He didn't express his feelings openly, that wasn't his style. But internally, the impact was significant. It shifted how he viewed collaboration within the band and deepened his sense of uncertainty. What once felt like a shared journey now seemed fragmented, with each member moving in different directions, watching a friendship slip away after the breakup. When the Beatles officially disbanded, the separation didn't just end a musical era, it altered personal relationships in ways that were harder to process. For Ringo, the distance he felt from George didn't disappear, it became more pronounced. Without the structure of the band, there was nothing holding their connection in place. George moved forward with new projects, new collaborators, and a broader creative network. Ringo, meanwhile, was trying to establish himself as a solo artist while navigating the emotional aftermath of the breakup. The contrast between their paths made the distance feel even wider. What hurt most wasn't hostility, but indifference. Ringo didn't feel actively rejected, he felt forgotten. That distinction matters. Rejection can be confronted. Indifference leaves no clear target, no moment to address, no resolution to reach. Even in moments when they reconnected, there was a sense that something fundamental had changed. Conversations lacked the depth they once had, the ease was gone, and without that ease, The friendship felt like a memory rather than a living bond. For Ringo, this lingering sense of disconnection became one of the quieter, but more persistent emotional threads in his life after the Beatles, the transformation that altered another bond. Ringo's relationship with John Lennon followed a different trajectory. Where George's distance was quiet, John's change was more visible and abrupt. As John became increasingly focused on his personal and artistic partnership with Yoko Ono, his connection to the rest of the band shifted dramatically. At first, Ringo accepted the change. He respected John's choices and didn't see them as a threat. But over time, the dynamic within the band began to feel unbalanced. Decisions that once involved all four members started to revolve around a smaller circle. The sense of unity that had defined the Beatles began to fracture. For Ringo, the most difficult part wasn't disagreement, it was displacement. He felt like his role in John's world had diminished. Moments that once would have been shared between bandmates were now influenced by an entirely different dynamic. This shift created a sense of loss that went beyond professional concerns. Ringo had admired John not just as a musician, but as a leader and a friend. Watching that connection change so fundamentally left him feeling uncertain about where he stood. The emotional impact wasn't immediate anger, it was a gradual realization that something important had been altered, and that it might never return to what it once was. The pressure of perfection and its consequences. If John's transformation created distance, Paul McCartney's leadership created pressure. After the death of the Beatles' manager, Paul stepped into a more dominant role, trying to keep the band focused and productive. His intentions were practical, but the execution often felt overwhelming to those around him. For Ringo, this environment was particularly challenging. Paul's attention to detail and high expectations translated into repeated takes, constant adjustments, and a level of scrutiny that intensified Ringo's existing insecurities. What Paul saw as dedication, Ringo sometimes experienced as criticism. One studio session became a turning point. Frustrated with a drum part, Paul demonstrated how he thought it should be played. While technically helpful, the gesture carried an emotional weight. For Ringo, it echoed earlier moments where his abilities had been questioned. This time, instead of internalizing the feeling, he acted on it. He left the studio, stepping away from the band entirely for a period. It was a rare moment of open resistance from someone who usually avoided confrontation. The incident forced the others to recognize the impact of their dynamic. Apologies followed and Ringo eventually returned. But the experience left a lasting impression, reinforcing the idea that even within the band, his place was not always secure. Encounters that reinforced old wounds. Outside the Beatles, Ringo's interactions with other figures in the entertainment world often echoed the insecurities he carried. Some encounters were brief, but their impact lingered. They reminded him of how easily he could be dismissed or misunderstood. Working with strong personalities in different creative fields exposed him to new forms of ego and control. In some cases, he felt undervalued, his contributions minimized or overlooked. These experiences didn't define his career, but they added layers to his perspective. He developed a quiet skepticism towards certain types of artistic behavior, particularly when it seemed driven more by image than substance. Having fought his way through illness and self-doubt, he had little patience for what he perceived as unnecessary excess or self-indulgence. These external frustrations didn't carry the same emotional weight as his experiences within the Beatles, but they reinforced a consistent theme. Ringo often found himself navigating environments where he had to prove his worth, even after achieving global success. That contradiction, being widely celebrated yet personally uncertain, remained a defining aspect of his journey, shaping how he viewed both himself and those around him. The man who exploited every fracture. While tensions within the Beatles were complex and deeply personal, there was one figure who approached them from a different angle entirely. He wasn't a band member or a collaborator, but an outsider who recognized the group's vulnerabilities and used them to his advantage. After the death of their manager, the Beatles were searching for direction. Financial confusion, creative ixtilafat, and personal differences created an environment of uncertainty. Into that space stepped a manager who promised control, clarity, and success. At first, his approach seemed effective. He was confident, assertive, and willing to take decisive action. For a group struggling to maintain cohesion, that confidence was appealing. But beneath the surface, his strategy relied on division rather than unity. He understood the personalities within the band and used that understanding to influence decisions. Instead of resolving conflicts, he amplified them. Instead of building trust, he redirected it toward himself. For Ringo, who valued stability and harmony, this influence was particularly damaging. He had trusted that this new leadership would protect the band's future. Instead, it accelerated the breakdown that was already underway, turning internal tension into irreversible separation. The lasting impact of betrayal and reflection. In the years that followed the Beatles' breakup, Ringo had time to reflect on everything that had happened. Relationships evolved, softened, or faded, but one realization remained constant. The person who had caused the deepest sense of betrayal wasn't one of his bandmates, but the outsider who had manipulated their trust. What made this betrayal different was its intent. Disagreements within the band were rooted in personality, creativity, and emotion. They were complicated, but they were human. The actions of the manager, however, felt calculated. They weren't the result of misunderstanding. They were strategic. For Ringo, this distinction mattered. It allowed him to eventually reconcile, at least partially, with the people he had once felt hurt by. Time brought perspective, and perspective brought a degree of peace. But the sense of being used, of having something meaningful dismantled by someone who never truly belonged to it, lingered. It became a defining lesson in trust and vulnerability. Looking back, Ringo's story isn't just about conflict. It's about resilience, perception, and the quiet ways people carry their experiences forward. The smile remained, but behind it was a deeper understanding of what it had cost to keep it there.